From New York to our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. I'm going to start again today on the markets. We now have the second day in a row right now of equity markets being down after a wonderful, wonderful April. So Abigail Doolittle is here, and she's going to explain to us exactly what's gone on so far in May.
There does seem to be a bit of a mood shift here for investors, David. Starting yesterday, you were mentioning that this could potentially be the second down day in a row. Wednesday, of course, we had that the Gilead virus drug rally, gave some of it back yesterday. And then today we have some of these earnings that investors are a little bit less than pleased with. In particular, Amazon. Apple put up a mediocre quarter, anemic quarter, I should say, withdrew guidance. That stock is basically flat, but Amazon right now down sharply, down 7.7%. And what investors do not like there is the fact that while sales are really off the charts, up 32% on a unit basis in the first quarter, the best since 2012, and they're expected to make $4 billion in this current quarter, they're probably going to plow most, if not all, or more of their money right back into the business on what are being called COVID expenses. Now, typically, David, this company gets a quote-unquote pass for that, growing for the future. In this case, they're not. It probably has something to do with the fact that this stock simply went too far, too fast into today, up 34%, so giving a lot of that back. And speaking of too far, too fast, Tesla ahead of today at one point this week had been a double on the year, but right now down about 11%.
Yeah, down about 11%, Abigail, but its CEO appears to have given it a little push or so. I mean, he came out with some tweets which are pretty extraordinary.
I would agree with you on that. It's very hard to interpret these tweets. Elon Musk tweeted not so long ago saying that the stock is too high in his opinion. He also put out a couple other tweets saying that he's selling many of his physical possessions, including not owning a house, give people back the freedom. Now, it's known, he is known for shooting off the cuff at sometimes in terms of tweeting, so it's difficult to know how serious he is around this. Will we get a mea culpa at some point in the future? But from a valuation standpoint, this stock is way too expensive if you were to look at it on a valuation standpoint. 31 times enterprise value to EBITDA, 110 times forward PE. And the chart, yesterday you were asking about technicals, this chart is caught in what could be a possible double top. If this chart, if this were to confirm, and there's no reason right now to think that it would, but if it does, it would suggest the stock is going to go significantly lower from these levels. So this tweet from Elon Musk, really extraordinary, as you said, in terms of maybe even fiduciary responsibility to shareholders to talk about the stock in that way. Certainly down sharply on the day, but over the last 2 years, up 131%. It'll be interesting to see if that gain, that huge gain over the last couple of years, reverses, and that tweet, that series of tweets, some sort of impetus for the selling, David.
Yeah. You don't see that from a CEO, but it is, after all, Elon Musk. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle on the markets. And now we want to turn to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, let's be honest, is doing some things we never thought we'd see it do, including lending some money directly to companies, including small and medium-sized companies, under that Main Street lending program once it gets up and running. We welcome now Professor Dan Tarullo of Harvard. He, of course, is a former governor of the Federal Reserve. So, Governor Tarullo, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us about this, because it is something we don't normally see the Fed do. You've been there. Do they have the competence to do this? Are they out over their skis, as we say?
Well, David, I think they've been put in a very difficult position. I mean, essentially, Congress wasn't able to make a lot of the decisions in the CARES Act, and so in essence has pushed it to the Fed to put together lending programs, not just for the kind of securities that they lent against in the great financial crisis, but as you say, the Main Street program, the municipal program, and the like. And as I say, I think it does put them in a difficult position. And you heard Chair Powell in his press conference on Wednesday really reflect that when he emphasized several times that the Fed is under statutory instructions not to lose money. That's number one. Number two, everything they do in these extraordinary programs has to be agreed to by the Treasury Department under the terms of the Federal Reserve Act. And number three, it just puts them under a lot of political pressure. I mean, what was it, 2,000 comment letters on the Main Street program? Those were not coming, I assure you, from average citizens, right? So they're being pushed in a lot of directions. It's something very new. And it just, as I say, puts them in a difficult position both operationally and politically.
So, Dan, as you suggest, the criticism can come and is coming from both sides. On the one hand, saying you can't lose money, you're not supposed to lose money, never have supposed to lose money. On the other hand, you're putting too much restrictions on. For example, Glenn Hubbard has been critical, saying there are too many restrictions here. You should be willing to lose more money. How does the Fed resolve that?
Well, I think that's what you're seeing. I think it's essentially impossible for them to resolve it in the short term, and they are under pressure on the one hand to get money out the door, and on the other hand not to make any mistakes. I mean, it's a very difficult position. You need to get the money out the door. Chair Powell was asked about that on Wednesday, and yet the Fed has already seen what has happened with the PPP program and all the questions and all the reports and all the criticisms that have taken place. So I think that's probably one of the many reasons why the Main Street program in particular has been delayed. And you saw what they came out with yesterday. It's now substantially more complicated, and that's probably in part an effort to both be more responsive to the needs, but also to try to fend off proactively some of the criticisms.
And Dan, what is the lodestar here? I mean, in normal circumstances, you had sort of a sense of how the Fed would resolve these questions. We could agree, we could disagree, but we knew what the standard is. Initially, it seemed that the Fed was really concerned with liquidity, making sure there was liquidity in the marketplace. That seems to have eased some now. Are they trying to ensure solvency? Well, what is their role in trying to repair a very broken economy?
Well, I think they're trying to figure out exactly what lane on this multi-lane highway they should be in. And again, if you look at Chair Powell's press conference on Wednesday, I think he tried to project some realistic expectations for what the Fed could do. He emphasized that they were not allowed to lose money. He emphasized that Treasury had a role here. He also made reference to fiscal measures. And David, I would say that at this juncture, the best thing for the Fed and the best thing for the country is that we all pivot more towards looking at a set of fiscal measures that in the next legislative package will extend beyond July the unusual and very necessary measures to deal with what's going to be a long period of double-digit unemployment in all likelihood, to make sure that we're getting money into the hands of EMTs and medical professionals and first responders, and to just make sure that those people who have been most affected, and what have we got now, 30 million jobless claims in the last 6 weeks, that over an extended period of time they're going to have resources. So I really think that the upshot of what I say about the difficult position of the Fed is it's not just something that's hard for them institutionally, and we say, well, tough luck, you're the central bank. This is a question of where the best way to spend money over the next 2 to 3 to 4 quarters is going to be.
So Dan, as you know, there's discussion that going on in Washington. It seems to be already a bit of a political hot potato. Unpack it a little bit. If you were to be able to write the next bill, that spending bill, what would it do? Would it be grants to states and local? Because that is something that's very controversial. Is it another check, $1,200 or some amount of check given to people directly? What would you think would be the most effective way to help the economy?
So my top, I think both of those should be components. But my top priority would be an extension and probably some refinement of the special measures that were taken on unemployment in the CARES Act, which, as you know, at this point will lapse in July. And as I said, CBO expects that we're going to have double-digit unemployment into and through next year, and most private analysts would agree with that. So I would say that trying to make indefinite the extension of UI to the gig workers, to part-time workers, trying to cover those who are not going to be able to enter the workforce, and also making sure that these benefits don't run out. I think that really should be the top priority. I did just a little back-of-the-envelope computation here. And even if you had no contribution from the states, if the federal government were to cover 2/3 of the average annual wage of American workers, over some period of time. At 20% unemployment, that's about $90 billion a month. Now, that's a lot of money. But remember, we've been appropriating, 250, 300 billion, which goes in a week under the PPP. So relatively speaking, if you think about putting the money where it's most needed in political and economic terms, I think that would be the priority. As I say, I also would do some of the things you mentioned, which is to those who are simply in need but not unemployed as such, to try to get some money out to them. And absolutely, how can we not be assisting the police departments, the fire departments, the EMTs, the ambulance drivers, the doctors and nurses, and those people from the public health agencies who are on the front lines? Their expenses and their risk are extraordinary. And it seems to me that there's nothing more common sense than putting that money where, talk about going to good use, it's going to the best possible use.
Yeah, as everyone says, they are our heroes in this crisis right now. Dan, thank you so very much. That is Professor Dan Tarullo of Harvard, and of course, he's a former governor of the Federal Reserve. And we have a headline breaking right now. Carnival faces a House probe over virus outbreaks on its cruise ships. We've seen various media outlets reporting that Carnival knew about this pandemic and it was on ships and it kept going. So now it apparently the House of Representatives is going to have an investigation into exactly what happened there. Coming up next here, we're going to talk about what was already a complicated presidential race and it's taken another turn today as the former Vice President Joe Biden takes the airwaves. We talk with our political contributor, Jeannie Zaino of Iona College. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. The coronavirus pandemic is likely to last as long as 2 years. That's according to a new report from infectious disease experts at the University of Minnesota. The report also predicts the outbreak won't be under control until about 2/3 of the world's population is immune. And the experts say people may be at their most contagious before they even have symptoms. Spain says that its rate from the coronavirus is holding steady. Spain has the second worst outbreak in the world behind the United States. The daily death toll peaked at 950 on April 2nd. Nearly 25,000 people in Spain have died since the outbreak began. The government is shifting its focus toward reigniting the ailing economy, which is expected to shrink by 9.2% in 2020. The U.S. Supreme Court's about to go where it has never gone before, and the country will get to listen in live. The court will hear its first ever argument by telephone Monday, opening a 2-week remote session that includes disputes over subpoenas for President Trump's financial records. The justices are allowing live audio broadcasts. The president will travel to Camp David today. It will be his first time leaving the White House compound in over a month. Mr. Trump's scheduled to travel more next week. He'll head to Arizona, a crucial swing state. The president plans to visit a Honeywell plant. The company is making medical supplies to fight the coronavirus pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, Vice President Joe Biden broke his silence today on those allegations about an alleged sexual assault some 27 years ago, and he on MSNBC emphatically denied anything like that ever happened. We bring in now our Bloomberg political contributor, Jeannie Zaino of Iona College. So, Jeannie, the Vice President had to respond, I suppose. Was his response effective in your judgment?
He did have to respond because this has been circling the campaign and him for several weeks now without a response as he's been holed up in quarantine. And I do think he was fairly effective today. He said without question that the allegations were absolutely not true, But also, I think even more importantly, or equally importantly, he said that this accuser and all women have the right to be heard, and that the allegations should be taken seriously and vetted. And I think now the question is going to come down to this issue of these personnel papers that he has asked to be released, and also I think questions about his own papers, which are at the University of Delaware. But I do think he had to do what he did today, and I think he was fairly effective and straightforward in saying that absolutely unequivocally the allegations are not true.
Jeannie, is there any difficulty or irony here for Democrats in particular because of the Me Too movement, the way that Kavanaugh was treated as he was nominated for the Supreme Court of the United States, and saying we should be listening to women? Or can the Democrats thread this needle, as it were?
It's a difficult balancing act, I think, for Democrats in particular, because on the one hand, they do support Biden's candidacy, obviously, and on the other hand, they have been the most vocal champions of the Me Too movement, and the Brett Kavanaugh hearing in particular raises in many people's mind a question of hypocrisy. And I think the real thing to think about here is how are the organizations, the corporations, in this case the Senate, in which the individuals were working, how did they handle these allegations at the time, and how can they be vetted 26, 27 years later? So I think Democrats do have a balancing act here, but I think they have to be very clear in calling for full investigation, full transparency, and openness. There is absolutely no question about that at this point.
So, Jeannie, it's not just the Democrats who have some challenges. Also, President Trump has some challenges. There have been various reports that his approval ratings have been suffering some because of this coronavirus, although he did tweet out one Gallup poll that said he was doing all right today. What is his situation? And particularly, some people are saying that Republicans are warning him they could lose the Senate. Is that plausible?
Before this outbreak, I think it was an implausible scenario that they could lose it. I think now it is increasingly a possibility, although I think a long shot. But I do think that the president is feeling some heat. We've heard that he is very frustrated by the fact that his poll numbers, not only have they not risen as they normally would in a crisis for a president, but they've dipped to a certain extent. He's gotten a lot of criticism for his handling of the epidemic, and the campaign has now gone on the offensive this week, releasing a huge ad buy to try to bolster what they say the president has done in handling the pandemic, and to make the case, particularly in swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and others, that the president is doing the right thing. The economy is going to open up, and we are going to get through this under his leadership. And of course, we see the Biden PACs at least countering that message with some really sharp advertising in the digital realm out in the last few days.
So let's talk about the election in November. However it happens, it will happen, we believe. Normally, it's how the economy is doing. It seems very difficult to believe the economy will be back by November. What does the president have to do, President Trump have to do to show that it's on its way back? How much forward momentum does he need to do all right in November?
You know, I think he does have to show that it is moving in a positive direction. I think the last month on Wall Street that was just reported out yesterday was helpful to the president. But I do think it's going to take a lot more than that. And in particular, again, in these swing states, which may end up being some of the hardest hit here, he is going to have to show that people who supported him during the 2016 campaign, not only has he really delivered, but that he's going to get them through this crisis. And I think he's having a tough time doing that at this point, that's part of this ad buy that's going on to show that this wartime, quote-unquote, president has done what he needed to do to pull the country through this.
And Jeannie, just one last one on those swing states such as Michigan, my home state. Are we now seeing the politicization of the reopening? We saw those armed protesters now enter the state capitol there yesterday. Are we seeing something like a new version of the Tea Party when it comes to let us out of the house?
Yeah, absolutely we are. And you know, I think it's an important debate to have, and it's going to continue throughout the campaign. And I think, in fact, beyond this may be equivalent, as you mentioned, to the Tea Party movement. These are people who make a claim that cannot be easily dismissed, that their liberties, their right to work, for instance, which is critical to all of our lives, has been, you know, unduly mismanaged by governors and others. And I think they're going to be making this case, and it's a case that resonates beyond just Trump supporters, but I think it has been politicized to that extent, and the protesters are being supported, we know, at least by some of the president's supporters. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this as we go into the fall and beyond.
Okay, Jeannie, always a delight to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Jeannie Zaino of Atlanta College. She is a regular Bloomberg political contributor. And now a program note. Tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we have Wall Street Week. And this week we'll be joined by Gillian Tett of the Financial Times, as well as Larry Summers of Harvard. That's coming up at 6 p.m. tonight Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for Stock of the Hour, and you guessed it, it's Tesla. We talked about it earlier in the hour. Tesla shares are plummeting now after its CEO said it was overpriced. And here for more is Abigail Doolittle. So one of the questions is he right? Is it overpriced?
You could certainly make the case that the shares of Tesla are overpriced. This is a stock, a company that you typically aren't supposed to talk about valuation on just because it's more of a visionary company and stock trading on the future. But if we do bring valuation into it, very overvalued, trading at a greater than 100 times PE, also a huge EV to EBITDA. The chart itself is well overextended. Crazy moves on the year. So yes, I think that folks on the street could certainly support that case. And also, if you look at analysts, I believe there are only 9 buys. There are 14 holds and 14 sells. So most folks on this street are on the sidelines at best. What's interesting, David, is it's really hard to make sense of this and why Elon Musk would make this sort of move on Twitter and these sorts of announcements. It seems to be a little bit of a continuation of the earnings call the other day when they put up what was a good quarter, a profit. They have a great cash position, moving in the right direction. But he did go off on a little bit of a rant around wanting freedom for people to end this lockdown.
Yeah, he's been saying that for a little while now, but we've had him tweet before going the other way, saying it's going to go up a lot. And he said he was in part trying to really punish the shorts. Is it possible he's helping the shorts this time?
Well, I suppose he is helping the shorts this time, but what's interesting is there aren't as many shorts as there were in the past. This stock is one of the more well-known shorted stocks out there, meaning that there are folks out there selling the shares, hoping to buy them back lower, a bet that the stock is going to go down. Now, traditionally, or for the last few years, there's been basically a 30% bearish short interest. That's very high. Right now, it's closer to 14%, so a lot of those shorts are out. One of the famous shorts, though, David Einhorn, and he was tweeting against Musk yesterday or the day before, basically on the accounting. It will be interesting to see whether there are any problems with the accounting. Too hard to say for certain, but always lots of controversy and drama around Tesla, David.
Always. Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. Coming up here, we're going to have a true expert on viruses. He is Dr. Michael Kinch, and he's written the book on the subject. He's going to handicap the race to find a vaccine for the coronavirus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. President Trump yesterday told us it was realistic to think we might have as many as 300 million doses of a vaccine for the coronavirus as soon as the end of this year. But the road to a vaccine has always not been a straight one through history. And we are very pleased to have with us now Dr. Michael Kinch. He is Assistant Vice Chancellor of the Medical School at Washington University. And for our present purposes, very importantly, he's the author of Between Hope and Fear, A History of Vaccinations and Human Immunity. So he really is an expert on vaccinations. Dr. Kinch, thank you so much for joining us here. Is it realistic, from everything you know, that we could have 300 million doses of vaccine as early as the end of this year?
It seems virtually impossible if you look at it both historically and practically. The time needed to make a vaccine averages between 10 and 15 years. Even if we were to put that on the so-called warp drive, it's really challenging, if not impossible, to imagine how in less than 4 years we would be able to get a vaccine that would be both safe and effective.
So, Dr. Kinch, we're told that there are several vaccines actually that have started clinical trials, both in the United States and around the world already. That suggests that maybe we are on our way. I know Johnson & Johnson's starting something in September, but how long do those clinical trials have to go?
Well, so in general, a vaccine clinical trial needs to be quite large and go quite long, and the reason for that is a fewfold. One is that you have to, when you develop a vaccine, make sure that you are not just inducing protection against, in this case, a virus, but that protection is long-lived. And so you oftentimes need to look many years out. Now, even if you're willing to sacrifice that and say, okay, we'll worry about the short term in the short term and the longer term over a longer period of time, you still have the question that vaccines induce immunity. They cause the immune system to recognize something that they hadn't recognized before. Sometimes, by bad luck, that immune recognition might actually attack normal tissues. And so then you run into a safety risk of inducing basically an autoimmune disease like, for example, a lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. So you've got to be very careful in your clinical testing to avoid that.
So I think some of us who don't understand what you understand think, wait a second, this is the first pandemic in over 100 years now. We have resources we never had before. If we put enough resources into this with the sophisticated scientific industry that we have behind it, we can short circuit that. Is that wrong?
Yeah, we know certainly our science is infinitely further along than it was 100 years ago when we were dealing with the Spanish flu. But unfortunately, there are certain practical issues. For example, if you just look at an influenza vaccine, just a standard seasonal influenza vaccine, it takes roughly 8 to 10 months. Once you've identified the vaccine and the virus that you're going to target, it takes us 8 to 10 months just to get enough vaccine to start administering to people. And that's in a situation where we already have largely optimized how to manufacture an influenza vaccine. So if you talk about now a COVID-19 vaccine, where we don't know what that vaccine is going to look like, we don't know if it's going to be a dead virus, whether it's going to be what's known as a recombinant virus, where you take a protein that you purify. We don't know whether it's going to be one of these exotic mRNA vaccines. And without even knowing that, it's impossible even to anticipate manufacturing. So, realistically, if you're talking about developing vaccines for 350 million Americans, much less 7 billion people on the planet, this is going to take potentially years just to get the logistics of that straight.
Is there an analogy in history of a virus that you think is similar to this, or a vaccine process that's similar to this that might instruct us about our experience this time?
Yeah, as I wrote last week in a piece, there are a number of different parallels with what occurred with the polio vaccine. And what ended up happening was that so polio for many decades had actually been the dread of parents, especially in the summertime. And pools would be closed and kids would be quarantined and isolated, not all that different than what's going on today. Then suddenly, Jonas Salk comes forward in the early 1950s and says, I think I've got a way of potentially coming up with a vaccine for this. The world's attention was focused on Salk in the same way that I would argue it is on Moderna and some of these companies that are developing vaccines today. And what ended up happening was that Salk rushed through his vaccine. It was safe. It was effective. That rushing, by the way, took 3 to 4 years, until they went from the first human trials to when they were starting to deliver it in widespread use. But then we ran into a problem, and that is that the manufacturing of the vaccine, and in the case of the Salk vaccine, it was a killed vaccine. So you would take polio virus, you would kill it with chemicals, and then you would administer it to people to induce immunity. That killed vaccine wasn't properly treated because we were rushing things so much. And a number of children in California ended up getting polio from live vaccine that hadn't been properly killed. So there are some parallels that if we rush things, you risk both safety, but then also you run the risk that you end up with a sloppy vaccine. And that's a whole other part of the question.
Can we avoid some of the risks that you're describing because we know a lot more today than we did before? I mean, back in those days, we didn't have the double helix. We hadn't discovered the structure of DNA and things like that. Can that really advance us so that we can actually, and maybe with artificial intelligence, run a lot of these tests in advance, really know the structure of the virus and the structure of the vaccine and shortcut some of this?
Some of this we can, and there are some of the early stage discovery work that we can basically bypass that. And that'll save us certainly many months and arguably a few years off of that 10 to 15 year time frame. But unfortunately, the immune system is an amazingly complicated thing, as evidenced by the fact that everything from rheumatoid arthritis and all of these autoimmune diseases that we're confronted with, as well as the fact that we're just learning about the immune system develop new cancer therapies. So the point is that we've got to be very careful in figuring out how to design a vaccine that will properly engage the immune system without causing toxicity. And that's not an easy thing to do. And keep in mind that we've been battling as a species coronaviruses from long before, for millions of years and billions of years, arguably. And the problem with this is that there is a counterattack evolution that's been going on for all of this time. And many viruses, and we don't know this of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 yet, but many viruses actually have evolved so that the immune system can't see them very well. And we see evidence of that from the fact that SARS vaccines, many of them that have been developed, really only ended up triggering immunity for a year or two because the virus was able to basically use its evolutionary advantage to avoid the immune system.
Right. So, Dr. Kinch, that was truly fascinating, if a bit sobering, but I really appreciate you being with us. That's Dr. Michael Kinch of Washington University. And now we go to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte is apologizing to Italians, quote, on behalf of the government for delays to their financial aid. He pledged assistance to workers and small businesses is in the pipeline and will be, in his words, stronger, faster, and more direct. He also said parts of the country may be able to open sooner than expected if rules are followed and the contagion curve declines. Encouraging signs out of Germany, the number of new coronavirus cases dipped, holding below 2,000 for a seventh straight day. The German government began relaxing some lockdown measures this week, but it will maintain travel restrictions and most other curbs on public life. In Japan, the state of emergency that was set to end next week will stay in place for at least another month. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said today the country's medical systems are still under severe pressure. Japanese health officials say they have more than 14,000 coronavirus cases with over 400 deaths. Experts say the numbers could be significantly higher. Joe Biden's denying a sexual assault allegation made by a former Senate staffer. The presumptive Democratic presidential nominee said in a statement today, quote, "They aren't true. This never happened." Tara Reid says Biden assaulted her while she worked in his office in 1993. This is the first time Mr. Biden has publicly commented on the accusation. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to talk with Richard Trumka. He is the president of the AFL-CIO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the stress continues to spread through the oil sector, and that includes Chevron, which reported its earnings earlier today, mainly reporting how it's cutting back on production and cutting back on capital investment. Its CEO, Mike Wirth, spoke with my colleague, Alex Steele.
It's in our flexible short cycle activity, so that would include unconventionals here in the United States and elsewhere in our portfolio. We've got some other projects where we can slow down activity and focus on critical path and reduce spend on some things that are not on the critical path. So there are reductions across our portfolio, but the primary area would be in the shale and tight, including in the Permian Basin.
So can you give me some visibility then on how quickly you'll reduce rigs and production there, and then what that does to your underlying production base?
Sure. We began the year with 17 rigs running in the Permian. We're down to 5 right now, and so production tends to lag rig activity, and so what we're seeing is production actually reflects wells that came on in the last half of 2019, the first quarter of this year, and as you know, these wells have strong early production. So our production actually is a little disconnected from the rig decline. Production at this point still is on an upward trend. What we've indicated is over the course of this year, we would expect to exit the year at about the level that we entered. So we'll see production higher than that through the middle part of the year, but we'll end the year about flat with how we entered and on a downward slope with this level of activity.
Right, I was going to say, so does that mean that we can expect then lower Permian production in 2021? It seems like that's what you're saying, is you're going to really feel the effects of this CapEx cut?
I think you could expect that. And certainly the other thing that we will be talking to investors about today is the fact that there will be other reductions in production, flowing production. So not just impacts of our capital changes, but certainly in this market, we operate in some countries that are subject to the OPEC agreement, and so there are likely to be some production curtailments there. And then for logistics and economic reasons in other parts of our portfolio, we're also likely to curtail production. So we'll see production here in the month of May down probably 200 to 300,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day, and June, same range or perhaps even a little bit greater than that.
I'm glad you brought up the OPEC plus cuts and logistics. Do you have a sense of how you're going to allocate your CapEx cuts, like those areas for logistics, those areas for OPEC plus versus your own choice, like say what you're talking about in the Permian?
Certainly our capital reductions are driven by our own views on where the opportunities are. We've got a lot of short cycle capital in our budget. That's one of our advantages. I mentioned we're different. We came into this with the strongest balance sheet in the industry, a very low break even, and a very flexible capital budget. So we're in control of those choices, and the market signal right now isn't calling for more near-term production. So that's why it makes sense to reduce capital in the short cycle part of our portfolio, and we're in control of that. The OPEC actions really affect flowing barrels as opposed to the investment of capital to produce barrels into the future. So and as I said, we'll reduce that primarily in our short cycle activity.
For that production, both for the flowing production and then the short cycle, how quickly can that come back, or is any of that, do you anticipate, permanent?
Well, it can come back relatively quickly. These are things that we actually do for maintenance purposes. We bring wells down and facilities down for storms, hurricanes, things like that. So our people are very good at bringing production down safely and then ramping it back up. So we'll come back up in a matter of weeks when we start to see the market signals that would suggest it. And this can be done in a way that is very careful and doesn't cause damage to wells or reservoirs.
That was Chevron Chairman and CEO Mike Wirth speaking with our colleague Alex Steele earlier today. And tune in later today at 6 p.m. Eastern Time for the next edition of Wall Street Week. We'll be joined by Larry Summers of Harvard, former Treasury Secretary, as well as by Gillian Tett from Financial Times. And coming up here on Balance of Power, we're going to be talking with Richard Trumka. He is the president of the AFL-CIO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. So Amazon yesterday announced its earnings, and it said it was getting a lot more revenue in, but it was basically taking all that revenue and investing it in part in trying to protect its employees in the workplace. We welcome now Richard Trumka. He's the president of the AFL-CIO. His union represents over 12.5 million workers across the country. So Richard, thank you so much for being back with us. Take Amazon as an example, because they say they're spending a lot of money, including in hazard pay, in leave, and things like that. They're doing an awful lot investing money. At the same time, you have some Amazon workers saying it's not enough for us to really feel safe. What do you think about Amazon and the job it's doing?
Job of protecting its workers. Amazon had a poor record before. Its warehouses weren't in good shape. And when the coronavirus came, they didn't do a very good job at all. Workers were too close. There was no PPE. And when workers pointed that out, instead of working with the workers, their own workers, they fired 3 of the employees for pointing out health and safety standards. That kind of retaliation is bad for everybody. So they need to spend the money working with their workers, getting personal protective equipment in place, and doing social separation and tracing so that we can find out and isolating people. Whoever has anything, we can isolate them and then trace back who they were touched to. Amazon has a long way to go to get a passing grade.
So, Richard, obviously we care about the health and safety of these workers themselves and their families. There's also a larger economic issue here as well, because if workers don't feel safe going back into the working place, they may well be reluctant to go back. At the same time, unemployment is unbelievable at this point. It doesn't seem to be relieving anytime soon. How do we strike that balance? How do we get a situation so that people feel safe going back into the workplace so they can get back to work?
Well, the first thing that should be done is for OSHA to adopt an emergency contagious disease standard so that we can have a standard in place to protect workers. When workers feel that they have a plan, when they've been educated and they have the proper PPE on hand, then they're going to want to go back to work. Until then, they're not going to go back to work, and nobody can blame them because we're losing workers at a very, very high rate right now. People are getting sick, and then people are dying too many. We're losing in every industry. We're losing them in transportation, groceries. The frontline workers, of course, are nurses and first responders. But every industry out there that's been considered an essential industry is losing workers and getting people sick because they lack the proper equipment and they haven't done the proper testing to isolate people who get the disease.
Richard, you and I have talked about this several times now, the relative absence of OSHA in all this, when we'd be expecting that to be the agent to really enforce it. Do you have hopes that that will turn around at the White House, or do we have to look for a workaround, some other way, whether it's state agencies or whether it's naming and shaming or investors' response? Is there another way to get there?
Well, first of all, David, think about this. OSHA is the agency that's charged with protecting the health and safety of workers. The president forms a task force on COVID-19, and the Secretary of Labor and OSHA aren't there. There's nobody to even pretend to speak on behalf of workers. That tells you that the health and safety of workers isn't in one of their priorities. It's an afterthought. What we're doing, and we're pushing for CARES 2 package to get that standard adopted, but the more that we can publicize it and the more that the public can put pressure on people in the marketplace to say, take care of your workers or we're not going to patronize you, I think the better off we are. The White House seems beyond it. OSHA, there was just a watchdog group did a study on OSHA enforcement, and I think this is telling, David. Before the president declared a national emergency, OSHA was conducting 217 inspections a day. After the declaration, the rate fell to 60 a day. And the number of citations issued by the agency since the emergency declaration has fallen by nearly 70%. They're just absent, and we're hoping to get them back, but the way to do that is for us to get an enforceable standard that if OSHA can't or won't enforce it, then the workers themselves can enforce it.
So, Richard, you mentioned the CARES 2 package and some of the concerns about getting some standards put in there. What about the aid to state and local government? And let me ask very specifically about AFL-CIO. How many of your members are on those front lines? Because one of the concerns is if the states have to start cutting back, they're going to cut back some of the people who are doing so much to keep us going.
Well, that's absolutely true. And the state and local governments are being taxed beyond any kind of recognizable limit. And here's what will happen. Now, we have 37 million people laid off right now in the last 6 weeks. If the states and the locals start laying off, that will not only aggravate the economic situation, but it'll take those people off the front lines. We'll have fewer police officers, fewer firemen, fewer first responders, fewer people to take care of the public, which will aggravate itself even more. So it's sort of like a spiral downward once it happens. We've been pushing the government, the president, and the Republican leadership in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, to give aid to state and local governments. They've been very, very, very slow to respond and very reluctant to help them. And they've also been very, very reluctant to help in any way the Postal Service, who's in dire need of money. It's been keeping us going. It's been a lifeline in every crisis that we've had. and they've been reluctant to
Right.
give them money as well.
Yeah, one last question, Richard. We believe 30 million Americans lost their jobs in the last 6 weeks. There are already some unemployed. What do you think the real number of unemployed in the United States is?
Well, the 30 number, there were 7.1 million before that happened. And so you're looking at, that's 37 million right there, and that gives you a real unemployment rate of 23%. But EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, also did a study, and they say that for every 10 people that have successfully filed unemployment claims, 3 or 4 people have been unable to do that, and another 2 haven't actually even tried. So that means there's an additional 9 to 14 million, and we're looking at between 45 and 50 million people truly out of work right now. To put that in perspective,
Stunning.
during the Great Depression, only 15 million
Right.
people were out of work. Not only, but 15 million
Just,
people were out
just
of work.
stunning. Just stunning. Okay, thank you so much to Richard Trumka. He's the president of the AFL-CIO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.